Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following a few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Welcome to the Humanist Perspective. My name is Jeffrey Brite. I'm your host, and with me is Jean Henri Chandler. Jean Henri Chandler is a amateur historian, somewhat a professional historian, semi-professional historian, since you've gotten paid.
I call myself a history aggregator. I like to basically take research other people did and just put it together and make sense to people not as well educated as they are.
Excellent.
And like myself.
And our topic today is we call it disruptive history, and we're using an analogy of what we refer to as disruptive technology or disruptive pricing in technology, which when a new technology is introduced, it disrupts how the industry has to operate in response to that, or a new pricing comes out and that it disrupts it. And we're using that as an analogy in history as some ideas and facts disrupt how we think about the history. Our topic today is about Copernicus and him defending a castle. Is that right?
Yep.
So why don't we jump right in? First off, I think we need to talk about you and how you got interested in these topics.
Yeah, so I'm involved in a historical fencing club, which is something that it's kind of a new thing that has emerged in the last 20 years. Where they discovered a bunch of fencing manuals, martial arts manuals for everything from grappling, that's kind of like jiu-jitsu, to sword fighting all kinds of different weapons.
These are European.
In Europe, although because this has happened, it's triggered kind of a search for similar manuals in like all kind of other parts of the world. And there's been a resurgence in China with traditional Chinese like fencing martial arts, and finding their manuals. And there's some that have been found from Korea, from Egypt, from the Middle Ages, from the Mamluks, from a lot of different parts of the world. And so that's one of the kind of fun things about it, is that it's brought a lot of people together. I've been involved in this for about 20 years. They found these manuals. They've been around the whole time, which is kind of one of the interesting things about it from the perspective of history, because a lot of people who are interested in things like genre fiction, your Lord of the Rings and all the historical movies and things, like Game of Thrones, were sort of maybe grew up looking for things like, how did people sword fight, 500 years ago? And we couldn't find it. It was sort of hidden. And it was sort of rediscovered in the 90s, and there's now this international community that's involved in that, and there's pretty well-organized fencing clubs all over North America and Europe, but also all over Latin America and the Pacific Rim, and South Africa and Turkey, just like all over the place.
Now, when you say fencing, I think most people conjure up the idea of the guys in the mask with the foil swords and whatnot.
Right.
Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. So this is historical fencing, which is it's similar to that. It's we kind of consciously created a different look, so instead of white coats, they're wearing black coats. But it's not like the Renaissance Festival or anything like that. It's actually a martial art, and there's competitions that are kind of similar to the fencing that you'd see, what we call collegiate fencing. Okay. And that itself used to be a little broader. It used to be something called classical fencing in the 19th century, and they gradually made it a little tighter and more sort of restrictive, and for some people less interesting, because it was more, just purely a sport. It's turning into something that's hard to recognize as fighting. Right. And so this historical fencing thing, at least for the moment, it is still like fighting. And because the manuals are sort of so unexpected, it's triggered some interest from academia, And it's created kind of an opening for some amateurs like myself and a lot of friends of mine that have allowed us to sort of explore where these come from, the context of these fencing manuals. And it's all pretty surprising, and it's in part of the reason why we just didn't even know it was there is because we in our modern culture haven't done a very good job of understanding that period.
Right.
And so this has given me some access, and I've got to spend some time in universities and museums and get some backdoor tours and stuff, and it's been a lot of fun. And there's an international community of researchers that are all interested in this, and we kind of work together toward trying to figure it out. And a lot of things kind of come out along the sides of it. It kind of gives us a pipeline straight into that period that goes past a lot of the tropes and the myths that dominate our genre fiction and so on.
Excellent. And so that's how you got interested in the history in general, and kind of it opened up that world.
Yeah. So mine,
and maybe academia. Would you say?
Well, I've done a little bit of academic writing. I've published a couple peer-reviewed articles. I'm not, I don't have a degree, and I don't have a lot of college time, but. And it's a lot of work to do that. I don't know how many more of those I want to do, but I have done some lectures, and I've done a lot of research, and I've kind of become one of the people that focuses on the context of the manuals. I have friends who are translators and who are translating from early New High German or from medieval Latin or medieval Italian, and it's an incredible skill I don't have.
Excellent.
So, but my niche has been trying to figure out sort of how this fits into that world, and how that world and all of it fits into our understanding.
Okay. Well, why don't you set the stage for us about Copernicus and how he differs from Galileo, and just so people know. I imagine most people know who Copernicus is, but just in case there's some people viewing that don't.
Yeah. Okay. So Copernicus was sort of a proto-scientist. He was one of the people that helped change our understanding of the structure of the solar system. They used to believe that the Earth was the center of the whole universe, and the ancient Greeks, who were very smart, were trying to figure out the movements of the planets, and they had come up with this strange math that makes them do little curlicues and so on. And Copernicus was one of the first people to suggest the possibility that the sun was actually the center of, at that time, what he thought was the universe, and that certainly the planets went around the sun. It helped explain the way they moved through the seasons and so on. And he did to a large extent, what Galileo did. Galileo is a bit more famous. They're both basically household names.
Right.
But Galileo often comes up in the context of this sort of modern notion of science versus religion.
Right.
You get like Galileo or guys like Giordano Bruno, for example, in Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos remake, which is fantastic. But it creates a somewhat oversimplified perception of the role of science and history and religion and how it all mixes together. Right. And the Middle Ages is always surprising. It's never what you thought it was. And so this is the context of Copernicus and why he didn't get in trouble, and why what he did was respected in his own time, and later without a lot of drama, so to speak. Right. Is worth looking into, and it kind of changes maybe how you see some of this stuff.
Excellent. So what do you think we should go from here? Should we go into the explanation of the war? Or you think going into like maybe the differences between Copernicus and Galileo? Why did Galileo get in trouble and Copernicus didn't?
Well, in a nutshell, Galileo inserted himself into a theological argument. First of all,
right,
and he did so. In Rome, he did so in the backyard of the Pope.
Right.
So he said, "Look, this is what the shape of the universe is, and this has to be part of our understanding of God."
And that was considered blasphemy at the time.
Yeah, that's
heretical.
Right. So heresy in the Middle Ages, and Galileo was in the early modern period, there's a pretty important distinction, but. Even in the early modern period, heresy really meant just like a violation of the brand.
Right.
If you're trying to hack or edit Christianity, that's heresy. Being a pagan, like worshiping idols, that's not a heretic. You may be treated terribly, you may be oppressed, and being Jewish or Muslim is not a heretic, because you're not trying to, unless you're trying to, invent some new version of Christianity. That's when they're going to have trouble with you, right?
Gotcha.
So they felt that he was doing that. Giordano Bruno was writing all kind of really spooky grimoires in addition to his scientific stuff that fascinating. But even by today's standards, The Shadow of Ideas by Giordano Bruno is kind of a spooky book. And, it's very interesting, but it was a sort of a direct challenge. I'd say Copernicus was from another era. He was about 100 years earlier.
Right.
He was in a remote area that was part of one of the parts of Europe that was very mixed up in terms of who was running things. And it happened to be he lived somewhere where his uncle was running things. He was working for his uncle, who was a bishop. And in a very complicated part of the world, in a context that most people don't really know about, but it just so happened that his uncle was opposed to sort of the most aggressive proponent of Christianity in their region, which was called the Teutonic Order.
Right. Now, who are these guys?
So that's another thing that's sort of surprising about the Middle Ages is that we find when we go back and look at the Middle Ages is that in the modern times we talk about crusades a lot, especially in the context of like modern wars in the Middle East and so on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that was the case when there were crusades going on was that a lot of them, and I could even say maybe most of them, took place within Europe. It was crusades by Europeans against other Europeans, quite often against other Christians.
Right.
So, for example, you have the Albigensian Crusade in the south of France, and if you ever go to Languedoc, Gascony, part of France, they're still angry about this. This was a brutal, just devastating, bloody crusade that wiped out a whole lot. It kind of killed an early incarnation of the Renaissance in southwestern France. And another interesting one is the Hussite Crusade in the Czech areas, in Bohemia. It was called Bohemia then. And part of the reason why the word Bohemian has sort of a context of a little bit naughtiness or strangeness or differentness is because those people had sort of a variation on the religion, it was believed. So there was a series of huge crusades launched against them. Unfortunately for the Crusaders and fortunately for the Czechs, they were really good at military innovation, and they kind of introduced firearms to the open battlefield and wiped out the Crusaders. And so eventually they had to just live with Bohemians. So that's like another weird thing.
Right.
The Teutonic Knights come into place. They were part of the Crusades in the Holy Land, in the Palestine, Lebanon, Israel area.
Right.
But they kind of came to it a little bit late, and they ended up settling up north and becoming part of what's called the Northern Crusades, which was a series of crusades and wars that were fought against the indigenous pagan European people that were up in the Baltic. That would be like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and a group of people that were called the Prussians, who pretty much got exterminated. And
so, why would you say that history, as taught? When I went through school, we learned about the Crusades. We learned about the first, second, third Crusade, and whatnot, and they're all. None of them ever refer to this. Sometimes you'll get a little bit that before they went on a crusade, they went and murdered a bunch of Jews, then went to the Crusades.
Right.
That's the best.
Well, you said the first, second, and third. You heard about the fourth.
My knowledge of history might be a little.
Okay, so a lot of people have heard about the fourth. The fourth was supposed to be another crusade into the Holy Land, but by then, some of these Italian city-states had developed lucrative trade relationships with the Arabs. And so as the Fourth Crusade was coming together, and a bunch of these very violent Franco-Norman knights decided they were going to go pillage and take some land and so on, and there already was a crusader state in the Middle East at that time.
Right.
The Egyptians approached their friends, the Venetians, and said, "Look, what's going on? Are you going to attack us? Are you going to help them come kill us?" Because the Italian city-states provided the ships, which is how you get from Normandy or in this case Sicily, which is where a lot of the Normans were, to the Holy Land. And they said, "No, don't worry about it. We're going to handle this." And they had a former patron, which was the Byzantine Empire. That was the Greco-Roman remnant of the Roman Empire that was in what's now Turkey.
Okay.
And they redirected, through trickery, the Fourth Crusade into sacking Constantinople.
Oh, is that what happened there? Yeah.
So if you go to, they put a prostitute on the throne of the emperor. They wrecked it. And if you go to Venice this day, you can go see the lions of the Hippodrome from the Byzantine Empire. So that's another Christian-on-Christian crusade.
Right.
They didn't consider the Byzantines Christian. The Pope didn't consider them because they were part of the Greek culture and the slightly different Greek version of the. Priests had beards. I don't really understand all the differences, but they felt it was very important. And some historians say that really what you have here is just sort of there's sort of a Greek zone and there's a Latinized zone.
Okay.
And they don't get along all that well. And that's also the issue, like with Russians. The Russians had, they had the Greek religion or variation of it. That funny-looking Russian Cyrillic alphabet. That's basically like a runic version of the Greek alphabet.
Okay.
And so anyway, that's a fault line, and so a lot of mean stuff happens across those fault lines, and including crusades.
So the Teutonic Order was a crusading order.
Yeah, they were extremely powerful crusading order, very well organized. They had taken over a vast area of the Baltic that is roughly the equivalent. It goes from what was called Pomerania, what's now part of Western Poland, all the way to the most northern part of Estonia today. It's roughly the same distance as New Orleans to Miami. It's a huge area, and but there was one spot in the middle, in between, kind of cut it in half, that was controlled by the pagans, which was the Lithuanians. That was the one pagan polity that they never could subdue.
And why is that?
It's not entirely clear, but it has something to do with the fact that that was a huge forest, and it was kind of like a Vietnam for the Crusaders.
I see.
And it was something to do with the fact that the Lithuanians themselves were just a really tough tribe. Like if you want to compare it to Native Americans, these guys were the Apaches.
I see.
And there was a lot of them. And they were also very resourceful diplomatically, and they were in a part of the world where the Teutonic Knights themselves also faced existential threats, like from the Mongols, who were the other neighbors there. So the pagan Lithuanians managed to hold their own long enough, and they forged diplomatic relations with the rest of Europe. One of the warlords built a city that came to be Vilnius, Lithuania. And he invited workers and artisans from all over Europe. And he said, look, you want to come and not pay taxes and live in my city and have no restrictions and have total freedom of religion? So in Lithuania, you had mosques and Catholic churches and Greek Orthodox churches and everything on the same street. Because you could not bother somebody over their religion, or these really tough Lithuanian warlords would just kill you. So, but as long as you lived there and were peaceful and helped them make things like crossbows and armor that helped them fight their enemies, then they left you alone.
Interesting.
And so they became very powerful. And at the same time, the Teutonic Knights was getting more aggressive and starting to annoy their neighbors, namely Poland, where they were taking territory from, and started to have a lot of strife with their own cities. So one of these cities was Turon, which is where the family that Copernicus comes from originates.
I see.
And so there's a bunch of these city-states they're called free cities. So they're cities that had a huge amount of autonomy that can be found all over that part of what today is northern Poland, and also in places like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. You have cities like Riga.
So what kind of liberties would they have? Because we kind of conceive of the Middle Ages as we got the king and we got the barons,
right,
controls everything.
So that's another thing. In general, our perceptions of Middle Ages and medieval Europe is kind of defined by England and France, particularly the United States. We're Anglophone. We speak English, so we get a lot of our history from England. Well, England's glory days were post-medieval. Their glory days were like the reign of Queen Elizabeth, early modern period. The Middle Ages, they were mostly fighting a civil war. They were a very agrarian society. They were a little bit like a Monty Python thing,
Right.
Whereas all the life and activity and technology was happening in northern Italy and what's now Belgium, and Low Countries, Flanders, the Rhineland, certain parts of Germany, and some of these little places, what are now Poland and Czech and places like that, and also like in Catalonia. And in these places, it was sort of like what we would today call a failed state. So if you look at the Holy Roman Empire, which is most of the center of Europe, it's a multi-ethnic area, but it's more or less substantially German, I guess you could say. There's a bunch of different dialects. A lot of them are German. There's also French speakers and Italian speakers and a lot of Slavs.
So that was the largest portion of Europe?
Yeah.
And that survived up until Napoleon,
right? All the way up until Napoleon. And if you look at a map of the Holy Roman Empire from 1200 to 1790, it's like 1,000 little principalities. And among those principalities are little city-states. And these are cities that start off with a little bit of autonomy, which they had determined in the Middle Ages, or they believed that they had to give them some autonomy just so they could produce things and have markets.
Right.
Because otherwise the regional nobles would mess with them and just shake them down and nothing would happen. So they had figured out that you had to kind of give them some breathing room.
I see.
But then what would happen is when eventually they would build walls. And when they did that, because of the nature of warfare in the Middle Ages, which favored the defense. If you had proper stone walls that were built by somebody that really understood geometry and were well put together, it gave you an enormous power defensively. And so at that point, then they pretty much decide, we're
not listening
their own
anymore.
right. They did their own thing. So, for an example, Krakow, which had a mostly German population in
that's a city?
13th century. Krakow is the capital, or it's not the capital anymore. It was the royal capital of Poland. It's a major city in Poland.
I see.
And they had a citadel, but they didn't really have walls. And the Mongols had come through Poland twice already and just wrecked it. And everybody kind of hid in the citadel. It's like a castle until the Mongols went away. And Regional Duke was having trouble with probably his cousins, some other dukes. And he had to run away and leave his family with the town folk of this little town in their citadel.
Right.
And he said, I'm going to Hungary to get an army to come back and fight my enemies. Take care of my family. And they did, and they were offered bribes to turn this guy's family over, and they didn't. And they held off. They fought off the enemies, and this guy came back with an army and defeated his enemies. And then he said, okay, you can build a wall. You were so good. I like you so much. You now can build a wall. 2 years later,
He regrets that,
2 years later, the third Mongol invasion of Poland happened, and they hit that wall. And they hit specifically the surviving gate of that wall, which was built by the Furriers Guild. All the towers were built by one of the craft guilds, like the sort of middle class of the town, and it stopped them. And from that point on, the town started exercising their own policies, and they didn't necessarily always go along with whatever the Duke wanted or even the king.
So this sets the stage for where Copernicus was? Is that right?
Yeah, so Copernicus was from a city called Turon. I'm probably mispronouncing that.
What time period?
15th century.
Okay, 15th century.
And as a child, his parents died. The Middle Ages, one of the things that is true about the Middle Ages is that, mortality rate's a little higher.
Yeah.
His parents died. He grew up at a time of what was called the 13 Years' War, which was a war when a bunch of those cities that had been under the control of the Teutonic Order and their giant state, of their Crusader state, which was very efficiently run, but if you did anything that they didn't like, then they would crack down on you. And so they had lost a huge battle against Poland and were trying to make the cities pay taxes to ransom back all their folks, all their Crusader guys.
Right.
And the cities, it was too much. It was like everything they had. And they got in conflict. The Teutonic Knights executed a bunch of the town council. The cities approached Poland and asked them, look, what kind of deal can you give us? And Poland offered total autonomy. So, just work with us, and we'll give you. All you got to do is just let us use your port, and you're good. So the biggest one was Gdansk, or they called it Danzig back then, and they started a war against the Teutonic Knights, which went a long time, went 13 years. Eventually, they won it, and the Teutonic Knights lost a lot of territory, which became part of Poland. All those cities became autonomous. The Teutonic Knights were still there, though, and they were machinating against those areas, and they were starting a series of more wars. So
the Teutonic Knights didn't recognize that this happened, right?
Well, they kind of had to, but they were always machinating and trying to penetrate and work their way back in. And their big problem was that the Lithuanians had converted to Christianity, so they weren't pagans anymore. So they kind of didn't really have a reason to be there, and that's one of the things that Copernicus' uncle, this guy, is a picture here. So this is Lucas von Watzenrode. It's a little black and white picture. He wrote a bunch of public letters saying, why doesn't the Teutonic Knights go fight the Turks?
Right.
The Turks are dangerous. They're really a problem. The Lithuanians were kind of friendly. You can go buy stuff from them. They sell honey down the street. You can work with, you can trade with them and so on. They're not invading us.
Right.
But nobody really wanted to fight the Turks. They usually died when you fought the Turks. Turks are really, really tough. So that's Lucas. Copernicus' family died, and Lucas, his uncle, adopted him.
Okay.
And raised him, and then recognizing that Nikolai Copernicus was a bright kid, sent him to some post grammar school education, and then eventually to university, where he became very highly educated. He went to university down in Italy, in Bologna, and then he finished up at the university in Krakow. And he became the right-hand man of his uncle, the bishop, and Uncle the bishop was kind of at the forefront. He was a bishop and therefore part of the church, but he was really from a burgher family, which is a family, like a well-established family in one of these towns.
What's a burgher?
So a burgher is like a citizen of a free city.
Okay.
That's where the word bourgeois comes from.
I see.
But the French version of a burgher is different, and there's reasons for that. But it's it's sort of like a middle-class urban person.
I see.
And that Berger family and that city in particular was opposed to the Teutonic Knights. And another one of these little wars broke out. Copernicus' uncle was a little bit old. It was his job to defend the district.
Right.
So he sent Nikolai, which you can see here. That's a modern depiction of a battle that Nicholas Copernicus fought in. So he was sent to this town to prevent the Teutonic Knights from taking it over.
Right.
And he organized the militia there. We have some letters that he sent to a nearby town asking for some more arms and some support, some of which he got. And he very efficiently organized the defense of the town. As a university-educated person, he would be expected to.
So now you mentioned that there's universities, and I don't think that's part of the popular mind. I don't think that the popular mind thinks that there's universities in the Middle Ages, and at least that would be that popular.
Yeah, so universities were invented in medieval Europe.
Okay.
The very first ever university was in Bologna in anywhere between 1050 or 1080, and it was originally founded to study Roman civil law. They had rediscovered something called the Codex, which was a legal book from the reign of Justinian. It's like late Roman period.
Right.
And Roman law was the basis for a lot of the law used all over Europe at that time. So knowing the law really well could give you all kinds of advantages.
I see.
And so they founded this university, and that triggered a series of other universities. So then there was one in Paris, Oxford University, Cambridge.
And it started to learn about the law.
Civic law initially, right, as distinct from church law. Paris focused especially on church law.
I see.
So I know we got to wrap this up.
Yeah,
so
let's go back to the war.
So in the battle, Copernicus gets to this place. He helps reorganize the defenses.
Right.
There's a hard freeze, which freezes the water of the moat, and a lot of times that's when the
that favors the invading army, right?
Right. So they tried to storm the castle. Copernicus had set up a defense in depth, using his knowledge of Roman tactics and everything he learned in the university, and he improved the fortifications and positioned the guns and everything based on his understanding of Euclid and Vitruvius and the fundamentals of geometry. And he won the day. A lot of people don't think of Copernicus as a warrior.
Yeah.
I really don't know if he actually fought, if he actually pulled a weapon out or shot a gun or anything. But he
understood warfare enough to
and he defeated the Teutonic Knights, which is not something that everybody did.
Right.
The Teutonic Knights they did lose once in a while, but it wasn't like every day. They were tough. The Teutonic Knights were really mean. They weren't the friendliest folks. They were good at one thing, which was basically killing people. So he stopped them, and eventually the Teutonic Knights they ended up converting to Lutheranism and stopped being Catholic. The whole thing kind of fell apart.
Right. Well, that was one thing I had read, just kind of going back to Galileo, is that Galileo was worried that Copernicus and the breakaway church that was happening there would get the credit for these scientific advances, and he wanted to push that. Well, I guess maybe.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, he was passionate about his idea about what the role of that scientific point of view had in religion, and the church was lagging.
Right, exactly.
But the church financed a lot of the people that we think of as sort of proto-scientists. A lot of them. I knew I was going off on segues a little too wild. I was pushing you too. Yeah, but really the battle is sort of the anticlimax because we don't know that much about it.